All right, welcome to our discussion. We just heard a great lecture by Professor Kruglański, and we will pick on some topics from the lecture. We are lucky to be joined by Dr. Katarzyna Jaśko, an assistant professor in the Institute of Psychology at the Jagiellonian University. She works on what motivates people to become politically involved. She collaborates with Professor Kruglański. And yeah, I'm so excited to have both of you for this discussion. Thanks for agreeing to join us.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I was uncertain about what question should I start with. And there was someone coming to the rescue. And it was Katarzyna who said, I have a question to start. So
I have a lot of questions.
Let's start with the question you mentioned.
Okay, so first of all, thanks for inviting me to be a discussant here. I mean, it's always difficult to be a discussant after Arya's talk because there is very rarely anything to discuss because everything was clear and unambiguous, but I'll try to add something here. So as maybe was mentioned, Arya was born in Poland, so he's Polish, but he spent many years in the US. I'm also Polish. I spent only a few years in the US, so I feel I was impacted by the American culture of positive thinking to a much lesser extent than Arya. So when I hear that the solution to dealing with uncertainty is positive psychology and expecting positive outcomes, I'm slightly suspicious. So my question is a little bit about that. So I was wondering to what extent there are other options than just solving uncertainty or becoming more positive uncertainty by simply expecting better and positive outcomes. So one alternative that I was thinking about was kind of like Stoic/Buddhist approach, where you, instead of expecting positive outcomes, you learn to appreciate uncertainty regardless of the outcome. So I was thinking, what do you think about this approach that instead of kind of forcing ourselves to think and expect positive things in the situation of uncertainty, we rather learn to accept uncertainty and appreciate the fact that life might be full of, positive as well as negative outcomes, and this is how it is. So that was one option that I was thinking about, and I'm curious to hear what you think. And the second option I was thinking was to ignore uncertainty in a sense, and instead of focusing on the future outcomes, focus on the process. So you kind of, I study activism, and many times when we talk about to activists about what they expect from their actions, they say, okay, of course, like I hope, to achieve positive outcomes. But even if we don't achieve positive outcomes, so in a sense they kind of expect or think that they might not, their actions might not work, they say it's still worth pursuing this cause because this cause is such an important thing, it's such a meaningful thing, it's a moral thing to do, so just showing up is enough. So like those two alternatives, like accepting uncertainty and not focusing on the future outcomes, but focusing on the process. So that's my slightly long question.
Well, thank you for this question. I think that the accepting uncertainty, the Buddhist approach is really interesting. Positive psychology is a very Western way of thinking. It's a psychology for success. How are you successful? You avoid your fear of failure, you become optimistic, you develop grit. This is very Western, very Americanized ways of thinking about it. The Buddhist approach is very different. And the Buddhist approach means accepting uncertainty, but reducing your dependence on outcomes. A very important aspect of Buddhist philosophy is to liberate yourself from desire, care less. But caring less has its own price. If you care less, you suffer less, but you also have lesser ecstasy. So, if you really want to be excited, to have very rewarding outcomes, you must not detach yourself from outcomes. The Buddhist approach is be detached, reduce your desires, liberate yourself from dependencies, and that would reduce suffering, but also at the price of reducing the possibility of great exhilaration, great excitement, great ecstasy. So it's reducing agony, but also sacrificing ecstasy. With respect to the second question, Kasia, I think focusing on the process is not giving out outcomes, it's giving out long-term outcomes, but really enjoying the short-term outcomes. Showing up for a protest, being involved actively is very satisfying. So that outcome makes you feel significant, makes you feel that you matter, makes you feel you take a stand. So it's still outcome-oriented.
Yeah, so I asked this second part of the question because I know your work on intrinsic motivation, and I think like part of this solution would be to focus on goals that you can achieve like immediately, right? Because then uncertainty is, I think, reduced because you experience immediately whether you have those rewarding experiences or not. So in a sense, maybe it reduces the role of uncertainty because there is very little uncertainty about what you experience in the moment. So that's, yeah. There's also a third option that I was thinking about, if I can continue.
Of course, obviously.
But I'll, let you ask your question in a second. So I was thinking whether it's really about expecting positive outcomes or taking rather more risky approach to the future. So when you value predictability and you avoid uncertainty, you basically focus on like safe options that are predictable, but maybe at the same time less rewarding. But the alternative approach would be to take this like risky approach when I think, okay, I might win a lot, but I also might lose a lot. And it doesn't mean that I'm like overly optimistic and I think only this highly rewarding outcome will happen. I take into account that also I might lose a lot. It's just my different strategy for approaching the future. So I don't think it would be necessarily like optimistic approach. It would be like risk-taking approach.
Well, I think that the risk-taking approach involves hopefulness. I think it involves a degree of optimism. When you take a leap, when you're skiing or doing something that entails a risk, you don't think about the negative outcomes. You think of what positive things can happen, that it's going to be enjoyable, that you're going to be successful. Tori Higgins talks about a promotion focus. You entertain positive thoughts. You do not think of the negative. You know that negative things can happen, but your mind is occupied with the positive possibilities. So, risk-taking involves hopefulness, I think. It involves focusing on the positive, accentuating the positive. And being aware of the negative, you're not going to be surprised if you fall during skiing. That's not, not exactly a surprise for you. But
always a surprise for me.
while taking the leap, you think you're going to do well.
Right. So I think that I need a little clarification. So when I hear all that, it seems to me as if there were sort of two dimensions. So one dimension would be this certainty, uncertainty dimension, and another dimension being the optimism, pessimism, or like excitement about the future, less excitement about the future. And so is the theory that you're defending and the things that you're asking about, is it the case that can we be placed everywhere in this space created by these two dimensions, or people who tend to be somewhere on the certainty, uncertainty will then end up necessarily in certain place regarding to the second axis? How are the two related? How closely? They are kind of mixed in all that. You have this certainty, uncertainty. So maybe the positive thing is the answer, but then it seems like these two dimensions are mixed. And I can imagine the question of certainty, uncertainty being considered in a way detached from the question of like more positive, more negative outlook. Are they to be detached? Is that just the case that they are not detached in the way we are actually operating? Can you say something about that?
Well, I think the question is how long you tolerate uncertainty. You can, if you see the positive aspects, if you focus on the positive aspects, you explore the uncertainty more fully. You are not prone to close your mind too quickly. At the end of the day, you need to act, so you need to have some certainty. You cannot persist with uncertainty indefinitely. But the question is how much uncertainty you can tolerate and how willing you are to explore the potentialities of the uncertainty. So, certainty and uncertainty are influenced by the optimism, pessimism. It's not that they're independent. One feeds into the other. The more pessimistic you are, the more you're likely to opt for certainty. You're more likely to defend the status quo. You're less likely to want to venture into unknown futures. The more optimistic you are, the more you're going to be willing to explore the uncertainty and see what it can offer you, the silver lining, exploring the potentiality in a crisis. What can you do given this crisis? But I think at the end of the day, in order to act, you need certainty. So it's a question of how long you can tolerate the uncertainty and allow yourself to explore it, and that is influenced very heavily by your optimistic or pessimistic inclination.
Yeah, maybe I can also add more a question than a comment, but slightly an extension of this question. So, because I'm still thinking that there are some situations in which uncertainty has a value in itself. So, for example, I think we already started talking about art. There are some people and some situations in which you would like to go and see an exhibition of Jackson Pollock. There's a lot of uncertainty. What does or abstract art in general, right? You see these lines, dots, squares. What does it mean? You watch Magritte and you think, oh, there's something going on that I don't fully comprehend. So it's more difficult, but at the same time it can be for some people again. And there's research on need for closure, for example, related to what type of art people high need for closure prefer. So for some people it will be rewarding. It will be effortful, but if you value effort in this particular context, then you might find it rewarding. In other contexts, or for some people, they might prefer pretty landscape, not something particularly engaging, doesn't give you a lot of food for thought, but at the same time it's pretty, it's predictable. I don't think it's necessarily a positive or negative outcome. I wouldn't say that people think, oh, Jackson Pollock is a negative outcome and pretty landscape is a positive outcome. It's the value of effort that's involved in processing this information that for some people might have a positive value in itself because they think of it as instrumental. Maybe they give them something to think about or discuss, with friends. While if you see something simple and not particularly, engaging, then what can you talk about? So I feel that I think this example shows that you can value uncertainty or ambiguity for its own sake. Maybe because it fulfills those goals of thinking or learning something. And another example that I was thinking about was science, right? You started your presentation with Mikołaj Kopernik, and I'm thinking that in science we also value uncertainty. If we all agree that there is certain mechanism operating and everybody showed this zillion times, then it's not really rewarding. You would not start writing research proposal or start doing research on something that everyone knows, right? You actually actively search for areas where there is uncertainty, there is ambiguity, and your goal is to reduce uncertainty. So I think maybe there's also some value from reduction of uncertainty. So yeah, I'm just curious.
Well, to begin with science, I mean, you're talking about a very important controversy between people like Karl Popper and Thomas Kuhn, right? Karl Popper was the champion of uncertainty. Revolutions in permanence. You always have to overthrow your more established theories. But it's very difficult to implement it in life because you need certainty, and therefore Kuhn talked about paradigms. So, the uncertainties that occur within a paradigm are very small uncertainties. You still accept the paradigm and you solve little puzzles within the paradigm. If you are really trying to shake the foundations of a theory, like Copernicus did, or Galileo and others, you encounter a lot of resistance. And it's the same in science today. People are doing very small increments to risk a big uncertainty, introduce a big change in the way people see things. You encounter a lot of resistance. And as we have seen in our paper on consistency, right? We talked, consistency was a very important concept in psychology, that people want consistency. And we said in our paper, no, people do not necessarily want consistency. Sometimes they want inconsistency. It depends on the outcomes. And we received a lot of criticism, right? We had a lot of trouble publishing that paper. So, the more innovative a paper is, the more resistance it encounters, because people, even in science, that is, the tool of progress, people need certainty, people need paradigms, people need what Thomas Kuhn called normal science, as opposed to revolutionary science. Now, with respect to art, it's interesting, even when you look at Jackson Pollock, or Magritte, Surrealist, Salvador Dali, or others, you achieve certain enclosure by classifying them. You say, this is a surrealist, now I know. Jackson Pollock is an abstract expressionist, now I know. So you achieve certainty by classifying them in one way or the other. You don't have to, really understand what the painting is all about. You say, okay, this is this crazy painting, it's surrealist, it's a crazy painting, it's abstract expressionism, gestural expressionism, or whatever.
Although that sounds like solving a test when you go to the museum. Like, what is it? Abstract art, done. So I think, depending on the goals, probably, right?
It always does.
So I think that this is related to something really interesting, and also to something that you were describing in your lecture. So there is this idea that, in a way, all inquiries have to end at some point.
Yes.
Right. And then you have different kinds of inquiries. So I can, for example, be inquisitive about whether it's safe for me to cross the street, a very mundane inquiry, yet very important. And of course, at some point, I better decide that it's safe, as long as it actually is safe, and cross the street, a small thing. Now, we move towards things like science, in which, we can say that a part of inquiry is even thinking what the inquiry is into, right? In a way, I don't have this easy, simple, objective measures of, this is the right place to stop. Plus, I might be naturally inclined towards coping well with uncertainty if I've picked my PhD in whatever theoretic subject I picked in, right? So, for example, there would be a difference between, I guess, engineering and theoretical science, yes. Right? So in engineering, I guess I stop when it works. When do I stop in science?
Never.
Well, again, once the uncertainty is too much, people develop a paradigm. And once the paradigm encounters many exceptions, there is a change of paradigm. But science proceeds from one paradigm to another. And you explore within a paradigm. So, there's always some kind of framework that science operates within. And if the framework is failing, it is not replaced until there is an alternative framework. It's from framework to framework. You need some kind of boundaries, some kind of basic assumptions within which to operate. It's less clear than crossing the street, it's less perceptual. But there's some agreement within the scientific community that things are the way they are, and these things are not questioned. The fundamental assumptions are not questioned until somebody comes, either a Copernicus or Galileo, that is crazy enough or courageous enough to question it, and after a while, maybe people are motivated to join that kind of movement. It's a kind of minority of people that usually suffer a lot for their courage, that come up with this idea. They are rejected, they are ostracized, but once the idea is implanted, there is a time at which some people are motivated to embrace it, and then it becomes a social movement and a paradigm shift occurs.
If I can add something, I think there's maybe an interesting aspect of like optimal level of uncertainty. So things cannot be like, for example, in science, things cannot be like too certain and too predictable, because then it's boring and it doesn't add anything. Things cannot be too novel, because then you don't have enough people who would be willing to accept it. And actually there is very interesting meta-science research where they looked at which papers have the biggest impact depending on what kind of past work they cite. So they looked at papers that cite mostly like new papers, so basically papers from the last 2-3 years. Then you can have papers that cite mostly, you know, classic works, like, you know, many decades ago. And then you have papers that cite, you know, a mix of both, like a little bit of classic papers, you know, published many years ago, and new papers. And those were actually the papers that were the most impactful. So there's a mix of, you know, you still connect to some established traditions or theories in the field, but you also connect it to the new work. And I feel, I mean, they don't, of course, we might discuss what are the explanations, but I think one of the explanations would be that you need to have this mix of new and old, and this is what creates the most like creative and also most probably convincing to other people in the field combination. So that would suggest that maybe the relation between, I don't know, impact and yeah, I guess impact and uncertainty is not linear. It's like until maybe like the reverse, you know, U-shape. Like when it's very new or when it's very predictable, then it doesn't have as much impact as when there's a combination of both.
Yeah, no, I think it's very true. I mean, we often say that we stand on the shoulders of giants, right? So citing very well-established theory gives credence, gives credibility to your ideas. But just staying with those theories is unacceptable because you're supposed to make progress. So on the one hand, citing the basic things, the principles and theories that are accepted by everyone is important, but on the other hand, showing that you're aware of the recent developments, so that's a good strategy to gain credibility. That's why they have impact. So it's a kind of strategy of manipulating your scientific audience to some extent.
Well, so that's one interpretation. Another interpretation is that when you mix those two types of content, it actually helps you produce the most persuasive and the most creative things. So
yes.
it's
so
a cynical interpretation and idealistic interpretation.
Right. No, I was offering maybe too cynical in their interpretation, but I think your interpretation is better. It's a mix of certainty. You have a certainty of the, you know, the forefathers that nobody questions.
Or mothers.
And of course, and at the same time, you're willing to accept the new developments. So it's kind of optimal uncertainty based in certainty and looking toward future developments, cutting edge.
So can we think about things like Kuhn's paradigms and citations and the rankings of the journals as a tool that we all use to decrease our collective uncertainty as a scientific community? This is actually related to one of my more general questions. So is there something like group level uncertainty? I imagine that we of course have questionnaires to measure personal uncertainty, how the particular individual is coping with uncertainty. But then I feel like certain communities, groups, and societies seem to be, in a way, collectively uncertain. Is there such a thing? Does it make sense?
Yes, I think it's a very, very good point. And I think recently there has been a lot of uncertainty because of developments. The globalization left many people behind, the financial crisis of 2008, the refugee crisis, the COVID pandemic introduced a lot of uncertainty in general society. People look for certainty. And what also happened, in part because of this development, the trust in society and institutions has declined. In America, the trust is at all-time low. You don't trust the Congress, you don't trust the presidency, you don't trust the Supreme Court, you don't trust the religious institutions, now you don't trust science, you don't trust medicine, and that creates a kind of societal level of uncertainty, and then you fall on your tribes, on your little groups, conspiracy theories, people who you meet, because the societal institutions that gave you, at one point, gave you certainty are no longer trusted. So it's a question of credibility. And of course, in science as well, you need credibility, the impact level of journals. You know that if you publish in that journal, you can be relied on, that the findings and the conclusions can be relied on. If you publish in a lesser journal, it's more questionable. So we need these, we need trust. We need trust. Certainty is based on trust, right? You have to trust your senses when you cross a busy street. You have to trust that your eyes are okay. And in forming your opinions, your attitudes, you have to trust in the sources of your information. If it's the media, you have to trust the media. If it's the government, you have to trust the government. If you don't trust it, you trust somebody else. But in order to have certainty, you've got to trust somebody. So trust is essential. Credibility is essential. That's what we talked about, the credibility of the forefathers. They are beyond question. They are beyond doubt. You know what? Nobody can question our forefathers. And so you need somebody to trust.
Yeah, I was also thinking about trust, but Ari already said a lot about it. But maybe one comment on the journals.
Yes.
And which journals you can trust, in a sense that it offers certain and predictable knowledge, because that's, I think, interesting in relation to the prestige and impact factor of a journal. Because you might think that if something is published in Science, then you can rely on it. But if it's published in a lesser journal, you cannot, or you can rely it maybe to a lesser extent. But actually, I think it might be interesting opposite to that, because if something is published in Science, it means it's very new. And if something is very new, then you don't really know whether it will replicate, if you do like tens or hundreds of replications. So I think with those prestigious journals, there might be a trade-off between publishing new, but at the same time, maybe uncertain results, because obviously like one paper cannot, prove with certainty. There's a limited number of studies they can publish in this paper, versus, journals that are of lesser impact factor, but at the same time, maybe they publish things that were already previously published in those prestigious journals, and it's only maybe a replication or showing under certain like different conditions. So I think there's might be an interesting trade-off, and sometimes people talk about those prestigious journals that it's big if true ideas, in a sense that it's a great new idea. This is why it passed the threshold of this very prestigious journals, but we would like to see it, replicate many times. So there are actually some of those replication projects that focused on, papers published in those top journals like Science and Nature. They not always have the highest replication rates and I assume because of that they publish really new findings. That's their goal. So maybe there is some trade-off between new and predictable. Just to add something.
Yes, well, I think that if you publish in a very reputable journal, the assumption is that it was very carefully evaluated. So at least these findings, of course, it may not replicate because you'll never know. Next time, the next one you see can be black. So the replication idea gives you, in a sense, a false security, because with a little change, things can not replicate. And the assumption is that if you replicate it many times, then it has some objective certainty. That's an illusion. That's the fallacy of induction. It's like this chicken that thought that every day at 5 o'clock the farmer comes and feeds it, until one time at 5 o'clock the farmer came and...
Are you saying that scientists are like this chicken?
Kind of.
Not all of them, of course.
Not all scientists are chickens.
Would you like to ask another from your list of questions? Are there?
Maybe other people would like to ask a question. So.
Yeah. All right. So one more question I had is, so especially when you transition in your lecture from uncertainty to positive psychology and the ways of like counteracting problematic situations in which we find ourselves, I felt like, oh gosh, this is yet another thing that I have to be doing. It's like I feel like it fits into this individualistic way of thinking about solving problems that is kind of prevalent, especially in our culture, right? We have it with, I don't know, you struggle with procrastination. Here's a bunch of things you could do to procrastinate less. You know, focus on yourself, work out more. I don't know, are you distracted by your phone? Here are 10 apps you can buy to block it. And I feel like we would really need collective solutions for problems like that. I feel like it would be great if we could collectively change environments in which we are existing and functioning so that it would be easier for us to deal with these problems, but also, you know, to support, for example, these of us who, for whatever reason, struggle more with uncertainty. What can we do to do that?
Well, I think, you know, understanding uncertainty, understanding reaction to uncertainty has a lot of implications for education. It has a lot of implications for society, for societal structures. If the societal structure are less threatening, if you have a greater social networks of support, you're going to be less afraid. You're going to be less concerned, less anxious. So society can do a lot. An ideal society in which there is less discrimination, less competition, greater support, would be a society where people would feel less afraid of uncertainty and less need to cope individually, because the society would provide the support that they need, and they would be more able to accentuate the positive, to explore, and not to feel so anxious about it. So I think societal structuring and striving for the optimal society, reducing inequalities, increasing the ability of people to live with differences is very important. So I fully agree with you that solutions at the level of the individual are not going to change societal structures that promote uncertainty and friction and conflict, and it has to be done at the level of society.
Yeah, I also think it's a great point and like super important. And I think one optimistic thing is that researchers also recognize this. So for example, there is this recent paper by Nick Chater and George Lowenstein that basically is like an overview of exactly what you said in different domains, like why proposing individual solutions to many, you know, societal problems is not enough, and they basically review the effectiveness of those interventions that focus on individual level and contrast them with systemic interventions. So I think that this is, the right direction that we should be thinking more about, and it seems that people are thinking about, and researchers are also, you know, paying more attention on this like change occurring at the systemic level. I would say that one solution to this is things that I'm studying, so maybe I'm biased, but like collective action. And like people basically studying threat, for example, show that when people don't feel individually, that they are, efficacious enough to change the situation. One solution could be look for collective solutions and like organizing, and this is also something that translates individual problems into search for collective and systemic solutions. So I feel that, for example, like activism or collective action in general is this bridge between individual level and systemic level, because like, in most cases, systemic change will not happen if people will not, demand those changes. So I feel there is research on that, and I think there is focus on how people cope with threats by kind of rephrasing those threats on the collectivistic level. So.
But collective action depends on the direction of the collective action. A Nazi movement, neo-Nazi movement is collective action. Proud Boys are collective action.
Absolutely.
So it's a question of what is the content of the collective action, and I think understanding the psychology and the social psychology of it, and understanding what a given action is going to accomplish is extremely important in addition to the collectivity of it.
Yeah, so I totally agree with that, that collective action is a means. So basically whether the means is a proper means, it depends on what goal does this means, as we all know and learned from Arya. So the value of the means depends on the value of goal. So yes, absolutely, protesting and organizing depends, the value of it, like moral value, depends on what's the goal that this serves. No question about that.
So how does it work in the case of collective action? If someone is embedded in a collective, and imagine this is a person who struggles with uncertainty, does their relationship to uncertainty changes, or they are efficient in doing things because they are participating in the collective? So are there differences resulting from the collective actions on the personal level, or is acting collectively a way of channeling the different energies that people bring into a common and good cause, hopefully good?
Well, collectivity provides you certainty. Collective consensus anchors your opinion. There is a certainty in consensus. There is strength in numbers. If your collectivity agrees on a certain set of beliefs, on a certain ideology, on a certain worldview, then you don't have any more uncertainty. And the social movements provide certainty to people. They do not have anymore to struggle with uncertainty, because the uncertainty is inherent in the collective.
But I would also say that a collective can act in another way. So basically, instead of providing like one super coherent and unambiguous narrative, it can give you resources to cope with ambiguity. So for example, if you have like climate activists, it doesn't mean that when they, come together and act collectively, now everything becomes certain and unambiguous, and you know what you need to do. But I feel there are like additional resources that you have friends in the movement, for example, or then you have somebody to talk to about your anxieties related to climate change. So I feel it maybe gives you those additional ways of coping that maybe reduce the need to have a certain answer, because you have basically your goals are fulfilled even without having this super confident and straightforward narrative. So I agree that this is one way of, group gives you meaning, but through the narrative, but at the same time, maybe group gives you meaning even when you don't have this coherent narrative.
Yes, it's very true. I think groups have basically two functions. One is providing certainty, and the other one supporting you emotionally. Being accepted by the group. The fact that you are an activist and they are activists, you feel accepted, you feel validated, you feel that you are a person that is recognized and that is given significance in social worth. And so I think these are the two functions, and I think both are very important. The cognitive, intellectual function of providing certainty, and also the emotional function of accepting you as a human being, giving you worth, giving you significance.
And then you can choose the Buddhist path of accepting uncertainty.
That's right. If you feel good about yourself, you can accept uncertainty, you can explore uncertainty. You become more optimistic because you feel strong, you feel accepted.
Exactly. It's very. This part is very optimistic to me because it's not like you are lost and you need certainty and someone serves you certainty so that kind of your problem is solved. But if you are unlucky and you are in a community in which the collective certainty is being decreased by doing something really bad together, that's one problematic way. And another way is just this having space for personal growth, right? And being able to be with your uncertainty, accept the fact that your relationship to uncertainty, how you feel about these different things might differ from the ways how other people feel about those same things, right?
If you feel good about yourself, if you feel you have social worth, you have this inner feeling of significance, that you matter, that you're a worthy, good human being, you can face uncertainty, you can explore uncertainty, you can discover the silver lining of uncertainty. It's your insecurity. There is a work in developmental psychology about attachment. In the early months of a child's life, if they're not attended to, if their cries and their problems are not attended to by an adult, they develop an insecure attachment. And that insecure attachment leads them to relate to uncertainties and to other people in very anxious and avoidant way. So I think once you feel good about yourself, you can explore, you can, and that's what positive psychology tries to make you feel good about yourself, feel optimistic, feel things are going to be good. And what I just said in response to Kasha's, that groups have a way of conferring a sense of significance upon you. That's what belonging to a group means, that the group recognizes you, and that's how it empowers you. Once you feel that you have the strength, you can face the unknown.
Yeah, I was just thinking that another example of that, outside of activism or political, context, is scientists. So if you have a group of researchers with whom you work and they form supportive environment, then it doesn't mean that suddenly all your results or failed experiments make perfect sense and you now have a super coherent explanation and perfect theory. No, you still have all those uncertainties and ambiguities, and you don't know what that means, what the results that you got, but then you are better equipped to deal with all those uncertainties. So I feel this is the function, kind of emotional support function, that doesn't that your need to have clear structure and certain answers is basically lowered.
Exactly.
All right, perfect. Thanks to that. I think we have some time now to see whether we have any questions in the room. I need to go downstairs probably to see the hands, if there are any, and if there are any questions from the online community following our discussion. I'll be right here in a second, and first the question from the back.
Hello, good evening. Do you think as an economic, political and social system, capitalism is increasing uncertainty?
What was the question?
I think the question was whether capitalism increases uncertainty. Did I hear correctly? Yes. You're from the US. You can.
I think it does. I think it increases inequality between people, and people who are on the losing side of inequality feel very disempowered, very uncertain about themselves, and they are therefore prone to all kinds of influences that would increase their certainty. So capitalism and competitiveness and the lack of societal support can increase not only uncertainty, but also the fear of uncertainty and the tendency to avoid uncertainty and perhaps escape to oversimplifying ideologies like Nazism or communism or other ideologies that promise certainty and at a price.
Okay, sorry to come back to that. I work as a statistician most of the days, and I feel extremely uncomfortable when we are talking about uncertainty only in vague terms. You know, like it is certain or it is uncertain. I really feel, and this is exactly what you said just before, that having a toolbox of a kind of think of it like that. We are not afraid of crossing the street. It is uncertain. We know it. We can die. Many people die every year crossing the street. But we still fear when we are taking off in an airplane. Those are two uncertainties that we are not very good at judging which one is more or less risky, and one we are acquainted with, and the other which is more like there are known and unknown uncertainties, if you see what I'm meaning. So I'm wondering whether there is any data on that, whether there is any kind of research done in how our knowledge about the uncertainty, like this meta-uncertainty, influences our attitudes.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask whether I understood this correctly. So are you saying that the two types of uncertainty would be one, for example, I know there is 30% of chance of dying when skiing versus it's uncertain, but I don't even know what's the probability?
Well, on one hand, yes. On the other hand, I tend to, you know, I have to cross the street every day, so I get used to this. You know, like I crossed it many times, never happened, even though there is still uncertainty, and I know it. Right? So there is, I lack some finer distinctions here.
Well, of course, there are degrees of uncertainty, and if you crossed a street a million times, you feel that your senses, your eyesight is good enough for you to assure that you will cross the street with great confidence and nothing will happen. In other cases, uncertainty is greater because you don't have that much experience. So, you know, there are degrees of uncertainty, of course. But I think the other thing is that I try to emphasize in the lecture, what are the stakes? How important is an uncertainty? Uncertainties about trivial matters do not really matter much. Uncertainties about important matters matter a lot, and in those you need a greater degree of certainty. And you know, crossing the street, obviously your life depends on it, but you have so much experience that you feel certain about it. But these two dimensions of the stakes, how important is a given uncertainty, and the degree of uncertainty, these are two orthogonal dimensions that need to be considered.
So I'm not an expert of this research, but I at least know that there is first distinction, which I guess this is the distinction that you're talking about, like estimation of uncertainty on the basis of personal experiences. And I think there are different psychological consequences of this kind of probability estimate versus, you know, if somebody tells me it's 5%, it's 10%. So there are different consequences of these. Don't ask me what are those consequences. I don't know. I can ask somebody who knows that. But I also think that the thing that I first thought that you were asking about, so whether I know what's the probability, 30% versus 60%, versus there is some uncertainty, but I don't even know what's the uncertainty. I feel that this might be like more threatening to some people because you don't even know how much you don't know. Like it could be 5%, it could be 80%, you just don't know. So I feel that there might be another distinction that would be interesting.
And of course, probability, you know, is a long-term frequency. You never know what's going to happen next moment. So the fact, you know, if it was infinite sampling then this would be the relative frequency over infinite sampling. But what's going to happen now, it's objectively uncertain.
You
And
never
you can
know.
always, you never know.
I learned something.
Another question from over here.
Hello again. I have a question for Professor Krulański regarding the link between optimism and uncertainty, and how you say that being optimistic may be a great coping strategy when it comes to uncertainty. And somehow I'm not convinced that optimism is always the best solution, because I can think of a situation where optimism might be misleading. It may lead us to some bad decisions because our judgment might be clouded and so on. Like, for example, during the COVID pandemic, when I'm optimistic about my future, and overly optimistic, like I will never get sick, nothing will change, and so on, well, I might be disappointed later. So I wonder if it's really the best solution in our uncertain times, you know, to be so optimistic. I think we need a mix of both pessimism and optimism, and I wonder what you think of it.
If I understood correctly the question was whether optimism necessarily leads to good outcomes?
I think whether it's good to be an optimism given that it can actually result in disappointment.
Depends what do you mean by good. If you're optimistic, you're going to tolerate uncertainty better. You're going to be more hopeful. Whether it's going to lead to good outcomes or bad outcomes, you'll never know. It could lead to good outcomes if you explore the situation and find a solution. But as I emphasized, in terms of outcomes, this is unpredictable. Uncertainty rules. This is whether you're optimistic or pessimistic. It doesn't matter. Things happen, and your optimism or pessimism does not determine the outcome that are actually going to occur. The only thing that optimism allows you to do is feel better about uncertainty, feel more hopeful. If you're feeling good about yourself, feeling hopeful is something that you value, then that's what optimism can promise. Optimism cannot promise good outcomes, nor can pessimism. Outcomes are something that is perennially uncertain.
I want to relate to your question a bit, because I think you asked about a pathological optimism, that you're optimist even if you see the things going wrong way. For example, you're CEO of a company and everything is going bad, but you're telling, okay guys, it's nothing, everything is going to be all right. But this kind of optimism, it doesn't take into account the reality. So I think you have to be an optimist, but based on the reality. You have to like see things, not imagine them.
But of course, what is reality is very questionable. Reality is in our minds, and what we perceive as reality can vary based on our cognitive psychology, the way we represent reality. Reality is not given, and we know after the fact that the person was overly optimistic or overly pessimistic. But at the moment, you know, the person who is perennially optimistic could be right, and in that particular instance, a good thing can happen to them. So it's very, very difficult to estimate exactly how optimistic or pessimistic one can be in order to obtain good outcomes. Again, good outcomes or bad outcomes are beyond our control.
I was just wondering if it's a good solution for the society as a whole to be overly optimistic, or to be optimistic at all in case of things like pandemics or climate change. I think that in order to take actions, we need to be pessimistic sometimes or more realistic.
You want to answer that?
I don't know if I heard the entire question. So what the part that I heard was whether we should be a little bit pessimistic if we want to take action. Was this? Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay, sorry, so that part I did not hear, so I'll try to answer the part that I heard. So I think when we talk about uncertainties, there are several types of uncertainties that we can talk about. And I think some of them might be positively related to willingness to act or well-being after our actions or not. So one uncertainty is about the outcomes, whether the positive outcome will happen or whether it won't happen. Whether, climate change, we can stop climate change or not, or whether, the government will, make a decision that we are afraid of or not. Now, the second uncertainty is about whether our actions, whether we can perform actions that might lead to this positive outcome. So whether the actions are under our control or not. So I might, for example, think that, some kind of collective action, I don't know, a protest, very radical protest might actually have a positive outcome. But if I at the same time am uncertain whether I can perform or engage in this protest, then I will not do it, or my decision to engage in it will depend not on the outcome expectations, but on whether I can do it or not. So I think to some extent, being pessimistic about whether positive outcomes will happen regardless of our actions. So if I feel that I don't need to act because it will happen, then people will not get involved, and maybe this will be like dysfunctional belief that things will generally turn out to be okay. Because people should probably rather think that things will turn out okay if they engage, depending, of course, on our goal. But if we want to mobilize other people, then we should tell them, things will be okay, but we need to do something about it. They will not be okay just, when we all sit and do nothing. So I think it's more complex types of beliefs that that should be analyzed when we think about whether positive or negative expectations will necessarily lead to action.
Thank you so much. This concludes our discussion. It was excellent and exciting. Thanks for the wonderful questions. So just a reminder to everyone, the Copernicus Festival is happening over the next couple of days. Make sure to join us in different events and see the exhibitions that are accompanying the festival. And thanks once more to Povi. Thank you.